The pit was cold and dark and filled with serpents. Ragnar Lothbrok, war leader, raider, king, stood in the center of that stone chamber somewhere in Northumbria in the year 865 and felt the vipers coiling around his legs, their fangs finding the gaps in his clothing, their venom burning through his veins. King Ælla of Northumbria had thrown him there, had ordered his men to gather every snake they could find and cast them into the pit with the captured Viking, had stood at the edge and watched as the man who had terrorized the coasts of England for decades died slowly, painfully, inevitably. Ragnar sang as he died, or so the stories say, sang of his deeds and his sons and the revenge that would come, sang until the venom stopped his breath and his body went still among the writhing mass of serpents. His death was meant to be a warning, a demonstration of what happened to those who dared to raid the Christian kingdoms of England. But it was not a warning. It was a declaration of war, a blood debt that would be paid in fire and steel and the destruction of kingdoms. To understand what followed, to grasp the scale and the fury of the response, one must understand what Ragnar's death meant in the context of Norse culture. The Vikings were not mindless barbarians driven by bloodlust and greed. They were a sophisticated warrior society with complex codes of honor, reputation, and obligation. In their world, a man's worth was measured not by his wealth or his titles, but by his deeds, by the reputation he built through courage and cunning and success in battle. And when a man of Ragnar's stature was killed, when a war leader who had led countless raids, who had sons and followers and a name that was known across the North Sea, was murdered by a foreign king, the obligation to avenge him was not optional, it was absolute. To fail to avenge such a death was to dishonor the dead, to shame the family, to demonstrate weakness that would invite further attacks. Vengeance was not about emotion, though emotion certainly played a role. It was about maintaining the social order, about upholding the bonds of kinship and loyalty, about ensuring that the world knew that to kill a Norseman of standing was to invite consequences that would be terrible and inevitable. Ragnar's sons received the news of their father's death in different places, at different times, but the response was the same. Grief, yes, but more than grief. Rage, certainly, but more than rage. What they felt was the weight of obligation, the knowledge that their father's death demanded a response that would echo through the generations, that would be remembered in saga and song, that would demonstrate to the world that the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok were worthy of their lineage. Ivar, called the Boneless, was the strategist, the planner, the one whose mind worked in ways that others could not follow. Whether his nickname referred to a physical condition or to a flexibility of thought and tactics is unclear, but what is certain is that he was the architect of what came next. Ubba was the warrior, fierce and relentless, a man who led from the front and inspired fear in his enemies. Halfdan was the ambitious one, hungry for land and power, seeing in his father's death not just a tragedy but an opportunity. And Bjorn Ironside, the eldest, was the symbol, the one whose name carried the weight of his father's reputation, the one who could unite disparate war bands under a single banner. Together, they would do what no Viking force had done before. They would not raid, they would invade. They would not plunder and leave, they would conquer and stay. And they would find every man who had played a role in their father's death and make them pay in ways that would be remembered for centuries. The Great Heathen Army, as it came to be known in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, was not a typical Viking raiding party. The raids that had plagued England for decades were hit-and-run affairs, small groups of ships arriving without warning, attacking monasteries and coastal towns, taking what they could carry and disappearing before any organized resistance could be mounted. The Great Heathen Army was something else entirely. It was a coalition, a gathering of war bands from across Scandinavia, from Denmark and Norway and Sweden, united by the promise of revenge and plunder, led by men whose names were already legendary. The sources disagree on the exact numbers, but even conservative estimates suggest a force of several thousand warriors supported by an equal number of camp followers, slaves, and support personnel. This was not a raid. This was an army, organized and disciplined, capable of sustained campaigning, of besieging cities, of meeting and defeating the armies of kings in open battle. And it was mobile, traveling not just by ship but overland, using horses captured or traded for, moving with a speed that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were unprepared to counter. The army landed in East Anglia in the autumn of 865, not as raiders, but as conquerors. They made camp, built fortifications, secured their supply lines, and began to gather intelligence about the political situation in England. What they found was a land divided, a patchwork of rival kingdoms that had spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. Northumbria, where Ragnar had been killed, was in the midst of a civil war, with two rival claimants to the throne tearing the kingdom apart. Mercia, the powerful Midland kingdom, was ruled by a king who was more concerned with maintaining his own power than with defending his borders. East Anglia was weak and isolated, its king more interested in peace than in war. And Wessex, in the south, was the only kingdom with anything resembling a coherent defense strategy. But even Wessex was unprepared for what was coming. The Vikings understood all of this. They understood that England was vulnerable, that its kingdoms could be played against each other, that a determined and mobile force could move through the land almost at will, striking where the enemy was weak, avoiding where they were strong, living off the land and the plunder they took. The first year was spent in East Anglia, extracting tribute, gathering supplies, and preparing for the campaigns to come. King Edmund of East Anglia, faced with an army he could not defeat, chose to negotiate to pay the Vikings to leave his kingdom in peace. The Vikings took his money and his horses and used them to prepare for the invasion of Northumbria. In the autumn of 866, the Great Heathen Army moved north, crossing into Northumbria and marching on the city of York, the ancient Roman fortress of Eboracum, the political and religious center of the kingdom. The city was taken almost without resistance, its defenses crumbling before the Viking assault, its people fleeing or submitting, its churches and monasteries stripped of their treasures. The Vikings established a base in York, fortifying it, turning it into a stronghold from which they could control the surrounding territory. And they waited, knowing that the Northumbrian kings, Ælla and his rival Osbert, would have to respond, that they would have to put aside their civil war and unite against the common enemy, that they would have to come to York and try to retake the city. They came in the spring of 867, Ælla and Osbert leading a combined army, putting aside their rivalry in the face of the Viking threat. They attacked York with everything they had, throwing their forces against the Viking defenses, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers. But the Vikings were ready. They had fortified the city, had positioned their forces to maximize their advantages, had prepared for exactly this kind of assault. The battle was brutal and decisive. The Northumbrian army was shattered, its soldiers cut down as they tried to scale the walls or break through the gates, its leaders killed or captured. Osbert died in the fighting, cut down by Viking axes. Ælla was taken alive, dragged before Ivar and his brothers, forced to face the sons of the man he had murdered. What happened next has been the subject of legend and debate for over 1,000 years. The sagas speak of the blood eagle, a ritual execution in which the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, the lungs exposed to the air, the victim left to die in agony. Whether this actually happened, whether it was a real practice or a later invention designed to emphasize the brutality of the Vikings, is uncertain. What is certain is that Ælla died, that his death was slow and public and meant to send a message, that it was not just an execution, but a ritual, a fulfillment of the blood debt owed for Ragnar's death. The sources, even the Christian sources that had every reason to exaggerate Viking brutality, describe Ælla's death in terms that suggest it was something extraordinary, something that went beyond ordinary violence, something that was meant to be remembered. And it was remembered. The death of Ælla became part of the legend of Ragnar and his sons, a demonstration of what happened to those who killed a Viking king, a warning that would echo through the centuries. But the death of Ælla was not the end. It was barely the beginning. The Great Heathen Army did not disband and return home after avenging Ragnar. They stayed. They continued their campaign, moving south into Mercia, attacking the kingdom that had been the dominant power in England for generations. In 867, they marched on Nottingham, taking the city and forcing King Burgred of Mercia to negotiate. Burgred, like Edmund before him, chose to pay tribute rather than fight, buying a temporary peace that allowed the Vikings to consolidate their position. But the peace did not last. In 869, the Vikings returned to East Anglia, this time not as guests, but as conquerors. King Edmund, who had paid them tribute and allowed them to use his kingdom as a base, now found himself facing their full fury. He chose to fight, to defend his kingdom and his people, and he died for that choice. The Vikings captured him, and according to the sources, they tortured and killed him, tying him to a tree and shooting him full of arrows before beheading him. Edmund would later be venerated as a saint and martyr, but in the moment, his death was simply another demonstration of Viking power, another kingdom brought to its knees, another king who had learned too late that the Great Heathen Army could not be bought off or negotiated with. The pattern repeated itself across England over the next decade. The Vikings would move into a kingdom, establish a fortified base, extract tribute, and then either move on or stay and conquer, depending on the resistance they faced and the opportunities they saw. In 871, they invaded Wessex, the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had not yet been subjugated. They met fierce resistance from the young king Alfred, who would later be known as Alfred the Great, but even Alfred could not drive them out entirely. The fighting in Wessex was brutal and inconclusive, a series of battles and skirmishes that left both sides exhausted. Eventually, Alfred was forced to pay tribute to buy a peace that allowed him to rebuild and prepare for the next round of fighting. The Vikings, for their part, turned their attention back to Mercia, driving King Burgred into exile and installing a puppet ruler who would do their bidding. By 874, Mercia had effectively ceased to exist as an independent kingdom, its lands divided between the Vikings and Wessex, its people either subjugated or fled. The Great Heathen Army began to fragment in the mid-872s, not because it had been defeated, but because its leaders had different goals. Some, like Halfdan, wanted to settle, to take land and establish themselves as rulers in England. Halfdan led his forces north, back to Northumbria, and began to distribute land to his followers, turning warriors into farmers, raiders into settlers. This was the beginning of the Danelaw, the region of England that would be under Viking control for generations, where Norse law and customs would shape the culture and the language. Others, like Ivar, disappear from the English sources around this time, their fates uncertain. Some historians believe Ivar returned to Ireland, where he became a powerful king in Dublin. Others believe he died in England, his death unrecorded or lost to history. What is certain is that the Great Heathen Army, as a unified force, ceased to exist by the late 872s, its component warbands going their separate ways, some to settle, some to continue raiding, some to return home. But the impact of the Great Heathen Army did not end with its dissolution. The invasion had fundamentally changed England. 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, had been destroyed or subjugated. Only Wessex remained independent, and even Wessex had been brought to the brink of collapse. The political map of England had been redrawn, the cultural landscape had been transformed. The Vikings were no longer raiders who came and left. They were settlers, rulers, permanent residents who brought their language, their laws, their gods, and their customs. The Danelaw would remain a distinct region for centuries, its influence visible in place names, in legal traditions, in the very DNA of the English people, and the memory of the Great Heathen Army, of the invasion that had been sparked by the death of Ragnar Lothbrok, would become part of the founding mythology of England, a reminder of the time when the Vikings had come not to raid but to conquer, when the sons of Ragnar had avenged their father by destroying kingdoms. The psychological impact of the invasion was as profound as the political and territorial changes. For the Anglo-Saxons, the arrival of the Great Heathen Army was a catastrophe unlike anything they had experienced. The earlier Viking raids had been terrifying, but they had been limited, localized, survivable. The Great Heathen Army was different. It was everywhere and nowhere, moving with a speed that made defense almost impossible, striking where it was least expected, disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. It was not interested in quick plunder. It was interested in conquest, in staying, in taking land and ruling it. And it was driven by something that the Anglo-Saxons found difficult to understand, a sense of purpose and inevitability that went beyond greed or ambition. The Vikings were not just fighting for wealth or power. They were fighting to avenge a death, to fulfill an obligation, to uphold a code of honor that demanded blood for blood. This made them more dangerous, more relentless, more willing to take risks and endure hardships, because they were not just warriors, they were avengers, and their cause was righteous in their own eyes. The Anglo-Saxon response to the invasion was marked by paralysis and disbelief. The kingdoms had spent generations fighting each other, developing strategies and tactics for dealing with rival Christian kings who shared their language and their culture and their basic assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. The Vikings did not share those assumptions. They did not respect the sanctity of churches or monasteries. They did not observe the Christian calendar or the seasons of peace that were supposed to limit warfare. They did not negotiate in good faith or honor agreements unless it served their purposes. They were, from the Anglo-Saxon perspective, barbarians, pagans, enemies of God and civilization. But they were also highly effective, disciplined, and organized, capable of sustained campaigns that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not prepared to counter. The result was a collapse of authority, a breakdown of the social and political structures that had held England together. Kings were killed or driven into exile. Armies were destroyed, cities were burned. And the people, the ordinary men and women who had no say in the decisions of their rulers, suffered the consequences. Their homes destroyed, their families killed or enslaved, their world turned upside down. The legacy of Ragnar's death and the invasion it sparked is complex and multifaceted. On one level, it was a personal vendetta, the fulfillment of a blood debt, the revenge of sons for the murder of their father. On another level, it was a strategic opportunity, a chance for ambitious Viking leaders to carve out kingdoms and wealth in a land that was rich and divided and vulnerable. On yet another level, it was a cultural and historical turning point. The moment when the Viking Age shifted from raiding to settlement, when the Norsemen stopped being outsiders and started becoming part of the fabric of European society. The Great Heathen Army was not the first Viking force to invade England, and it would not be the last. But it was the most significant, the one that changed the course of English history, the one that established the Danelaw and set the stage for the eventual unification of England under a single crown. And it all began with an old man standing in a pit of snakes, singing of revenge as the venom stopped his heart. The story of Ragnar and his sons has been told and retold for over 1,000 years, growing in the telling, becoming legend, becoming myth. But beneath the legend is a historical reality, a reality of violence and ambition and the consequences of actions. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he was a single historical figure or a composite of several Viking leaders, was a man whose death mattered, whose murder by King Ælla was not just a personal tragedy, but a political and cultural event that demanded a response. His sons, whether they were actually his biological children or simply leaders who claimed his legacy, understood that response had to be overwhelming, that it had to be public, that it had to demonstrate to the world that the death of a Viking king could not be ignored or dismissed. And so they gathered an army, the largest Viking force that England had ever seen, and they invaded. Not to raid, but to conquer. Not to plunder and leave, but to stay and rule. They found the men responsible for their father's death, and they killed them, slowly and publicly, in ways that would be remembered. And then they continued destroying kingdoms, taking land, changing the map of England forever. The Great Heathen Army was not a mindless horde. It was a calculated response to a specific event, a demonstration of the power of memory and obligation in Viking culture, a military campaign that was as much about honor and reputation as it was about wealth and power. The Vikings who followed Ivar and Ubba and Halfdan and Bjorn were not fighting for abstract ideals or religious fervor. They were fighting for tangible rewards, for land and silver and slaves, but they were also fighting for something less tangible, for the respect of their peers, for the approval of their gods, for the knowledge that they were fulfilling their duty to their kin and their culture. This combination of practical ambition and cultural obligation made them formidable, made them willing to endure hardships and take risks that other armies would not, made them capable of sustaining a campaign that lasted for over a decade and fundamentally altered the political landscape of England. The invasion also revealed the weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, weaknesses that would take generations to overcome. The kingdoms were divided, their rulers more concerned with their own power and their rivalries with each other than with the common defense. They had no standing armies, no permanent military forces that could respond quickly to threats. Their military system was based on the fired, a levy of free men who were called up in times of war, but who were farmers and craftsmen first and soldiers second. This system worked well enough for dealing with local threats or short campaigns, but it was inadequate for dealing with a mobile, professional force like the Great Heathen Army. The Vikings could move faster, could concentrate their forces more effectively, could choose when and where to fight, and could avoid battles they did not think they could win. The Anglo-Saxons, by contrast, were reactive, always responding to Viking moves rather than anticipating them, always trying to catch up rather than getting ahead. It would take the genius of Alfred the Great to develop a system that could counter the Viking threat, a system of fortified towns, a standing navy, a reorganized military that could match the Vikings in mobility and effectiveness. But even Alfred could not drive the Vikings out entirely. He could only contain them, limit their expansion, create a boundary between the Danelaw and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would last for generations. The memory of the Great Heathen Army, of the invasion sparked by Ragnar's death, became part of the cultural memory of both the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. For the Vikings, it was a demonstration of the power of vengeance, a proof that the old ways still mattered, that honor and reputation were worth fighting for, that the bonds of kinship and loyalty were stronger than the fear of death. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a trauma, a catastrophe that reshaped their world, that forced them to adapt and change, that taught them hard lessons about the nature of warfare and the importance of unity and preparedness. The invasion was not just a military campaign. It was a cultural collision, a meeting of two very different societies with very different values and very different ways of understanding the world. And out of that collision came something new, a hybrid culture that combined elements of both Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions, a culture that would eventually evolve into medieval England. The death of Ragnar Lothbrok in a pit of snakes was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter written in blood and fire, a chapter that would reshape the history of England and the North Atlantic world. His sons took his death and turned it into a weapon, a justification for an invasion that would have happened anyway, but that gained added force and legitimacy from the narrative of vengeance. They understood that memory is power, that stories shape reality, that the death of a king can be more powerful than his life if it is used correctly. And they used it brilliantly and ruthlessly to unite disparate war bands under a common cause, to justify actions that might otherwise have been seen as mere piracy or banditry, to create a legacy that would outlast them all. The Great Heathen Army was many things: a military force, a political movement, a cultural phenomenon. But at its core, it was a response to a death, a fulfillment of an obligation, a demonstration that in the world of the Vikings, some debts could only be paid in blood, and some memories could only be honored through destruction. Ragnar died in darkness, surrounded by serpents, but his death lit a fire that burned across England for a generation, a fire that his sons fed with the bodies of his enemies, a fire that transformed the world and left a legacy that endures to this day. The physical reality of the invasion was brutal and unrelenting. The Great Heathen Army moved through England like a storm, leaving destruction in its wake. The Vikings traveled light, living off the land, taking what they needed from the people they conquered. They burned villages and farms, not out of mindless cruelty, but as a deliberate strategy, destroying the economic base that supported the Anglo-Saxon armies, creating refugees who fled before them, and spread panic and despair. They took livestock and grain, leaving the population to starve through the winter. They enslaved those who could not flee or fight, men and women and children who were marched to the coast and shipped across the North Sea to be sold in the slave markets of Scandinavia and beyond. The slave trade was one of the economic engines of the Viking world, and the invasion of England provided a seemingly endless supply of captives. The psychological impact of this was devastating. The Anglo-Saxons had raided and enslaved each other during their own wars, but the scale and efficiency of Viking slaving was something new, something that created a terror that went beyond the fear of death in battle. The weather during those years of invasion was often harsh, adding to the misery of both the invaded and the invaders. The winters were cold and wet, the springs brought floods, the summers were short and unpredictable. The Vikings, accustomed to the harsh climate of Scandinavia, were better prepared for these conditions than the Anglo-Saxons, who had grown soft in the relative prosperity of the 8th and early 9th centuries. The Vikings wore wool and leather, practical clothing that could be layered and adjusted for different conditions. They built temporary shelters quickly and efficiently, using whatever materials were at hand. They were comfortable sleeping on the ground, eating cold food, enduring discomfort without complaint. The Anglo-Saxon armies, by contrast, were less mobile, less adaptable, more dependent on supply lines and permanent fortifications. When the Vikings moved, they moved fast, covering distances in days that would take the Anglo-Saxons weeks. When they camped, they fortified their positions, digging ditches and building palisades, creating defensive works that could hold off much larger forces. And when they fought with a ferocity and discipline that came from years of training and experience, from a culture that valued martial prowess above almost everything else. The battles themselves were chaotic and terrifying, nothing like the ordered affairs depicted in later medieval manuscripts. The Vikings fought in a loose formation, using axes and swords and spears, relying on individual skill and courage as much as on collective discipline. They used shields not just for defense, but as weapons, bashing and pushing, creating openings for their blades. They aimed for the legs and arms, for the gaps in armor, for the vulnerable points that would disable an opponent without necessarily killing him immediately. The wounded were often left to die slowly on the battlefield, their screams and moans adding to the psychological pressure on those still fighting. The Anglo-Saxons fought in a similar style, but they were often less experienced, less confident, less willing to take the risks that the Vikings took as a matter of course. The result was that even when the numbers were roughly equal, the Vikings often won, not through superior tactics or equipment, but through superior morale and aggression. The Siege of York in 867 was a turning point, not just militarily, but psychologically. York was one of the great cities of Anglo-Saxon England, a center of learning and commerce, a symbol of Northumbrian power and prestige. Its fall to the Vikings was a shock that reverberated across the island. The city had Roman walls, stone fortifications that had stood for centuries that were supposed to be impregnable. But the Vikings had experience with sieges, had learned techniques from their raids on the continent, where they had attacked fortified towns and monasteries. They knew how to undermine walls, how to build siege engines, how to starve out a garrison, and they had patience, the willingness to sit outside a city for weeks or months if necessary, waiting for hunger and disease to do their work. When the Northumbrian army arrived to relieve the city, the Vikings were ready. They had prepared the battlefield, had positioned their forces to take advantage of the terrain, had anticipated the Anglo-Saxon tactics. The battle was over in hours. The Northumbrian army shattered, its leaders dead or captured. The survivors fled, spreading the news of the disaster, carrying with them the knowledge that the Vikings were not just raiders but conquerors, that they had the capability and the will to take and hold the greatest cities of England. The death of King Ælla was not just an execution. It was a ritual, a public demonstration of Viking justice, a fulfillment of the blood debt owed for Ragnar's death. Whether the Blood Eagle was actually performed is less important than the fact that the Anglo-Saxons believed it was, that the story of Ælla's death became part of the legend of the Great Heathen Army, a warning to anyone who might consider resisting. The Vikings understood the power of terror, the way that a single act of extreme violence could paralyze an entire population, could make people choose submission over resistance, could break the will to fight, before a battle even began. Ælla's death served that purpose. It demonstrated that the Vikings were not bound by Christian notions of mercy or forgiveness, that they operated according to a different moral code, one that demanded blood for blood, that saw vengeance not as a sin, but as a duty. And it sent a message to the other Anglo-Saxon kings. This is what happens to those who kill Vikings. This is the price of defiance. But the invasion was not just about vengeance. It was also about opportunity, about the chance to carve out kingdoms and wealth in a land that was rich and vulnerable. The Vikings, who followed Ivar and his brothers, were not all motivated by loyalty to Ragnar's memory. Many of them were younger sons with no inheritance, warriors with no land, men who saw in England a chance to become something more than they could ever be in Scandinavia. The social structure of Viking society was hierarchical and rigid. Land was passed down through families, and those who were not firstborn sons often had limited options. They could stay home and work for their older brothers, accepting a subordinate position. They could become traders or craftsmen, respectable but not prestigious occupations. Or they could become warriors, joining a warband, seeking glory and wealth through raiding and conquest. The Great Heathen Army offered these men a chance to become landowners, to establish themselves as lords and rulers, to create dynasties that would last for generations. This was the real prize. Not the silver and slaves that could be taken in a raid, but the land itself. The ability to settle and farm and build something permanent. The settlement of the Danelaw was a gradual process, not a single event. As the Great Heathen Army fragmented in the 870 seconds, different leaders took different paths. Halfdan led his followers back to Northumbria and began to distribute land, parceling out estates to his warriors, creating a new ruling class that was Norse in culture and language, but that would gradually blend with the existing Anglo-Saxon population. The process was not always peaceful. There were conflicts over land ownership, disputes between the new Viking settlers and the Anglo-Saxons who had lived there for generations. But over time, a hybrid culture emerged, one that combined elements of both traditions. The Vikings brought their language, and many English words, particularly those related to law and governance, have Norse origins. They brought their legal traditions, and the Danelaw operated under a different legal system than the rest of England, one that gave more rights to free men, and that was less hierarchical than Anglo-Saxon law. They brought their gods, and for a time, pagan temples stood alongside Christian churches, though eventually Christianity would prevail, absorbing and transforming the Norse religious practices rather than simply replacing them. The impact on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that survived was profound and lasting. Wessex, under Alfred the Great, was forced to innovate, to develop new strategies and new institutions to deal with the Viking threat. Alfred reorganized the military, creating a system of fortified towns called burhs that could serve as refuges for the population and as bases for military operations. He built a navy, understanding that to fight the Vikings effectively, he needed to be able to challenge them at sea, to intercept their fleets before they could land, to cut off their supply lines and their escape routes. He reformed the legal system, creating a unified code of laws that drew on both Anglo-Saxon and biblical traditions, establishing himself not just as a military leader, but as a lawgiver and a defender of Christian civilization. And he promoted education and literacy, understanding that the survival of Anglo-Saxon culture depended on preserving its written traditions, its history, and its laws and its religious texts. Alfred's reforms were a direct response to the Viking threat, and they laid the foundation for the eventual unification of England under a single crown. Without the Great Heathen Army, without the crisis that it created, Alfred might never have had the opportunity or the necessity to transform Wessex into the dominant power in England. The cultural memory of the invasion shaped both Viking and Anglo-Saxon identity for centuries. For the Vikings, the Great Heathen Army became part of the heroic age, a time when great deeds were done, when warriors could win fame and fortune through courage and skill. The sagas that were written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, hundreds of years after the events, preserved the memory of Ragnar and his sons, turning them into legendary figures, heroes whose exploits were told and retold around fires in longhouses across the North Atlantic world. The historical reality was more complex and more ambiguous, but the legend served a purpose, providing models of behavior, demonstrating the values that Viking society held dear, reinforcing the importance of honor and reputation, and the obligation to avenge wrongs. For the Anglo-Saxons, the invasion was a trauma, a catastrophe that had to be understood and explained. The chroniclers, who wrote about the Great Heathen Army, mostly monks writing in monasteries that had themselves been targets of Viking raids, portrayed the invasion as a punishment from God, a consequence of the sins of the English people, a trial that had to be endured and overcome. This interpretation served a theological purpose, fitting the events into a Christian framework, but it also served a political purpose, providing a narrative that could unite the surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against a common enemy, that could justify the wars of reconquest that would eventually push the Vikings back and reclaim the Danelaw for English rule. The long-term consequences of the invasion extended far beyond England. The success of the Great Heathen Army inspired other Viking leaders to attempt similar conquests. In the decades that followed, Viking armies invaded and settled in Ireland, in Scotland, in the Frankish kingdoms on the continent. The pattern was the same: a mobile, disciplined force exploiting political divisions, taking land, establishing settlements, creating hybrid cultures that blended Norse and local traditions. The Viking Age, which had begun with raids, evolved into an age of conquest and settlement, an age in which the Norsemen became not just raiders, but rulers, not just outsiders, but insiders, not just destroyers, but builders. The kingdoms they established, from Dublin to Kiev, from Normandy to Sicily, would shape the political map of Europe for centuries, and it all traced back, in some sense, to the death of Ragnar Lothbrok and the response of his sons to the decision to transform personal vengeance into organized conquest, to the understanding that memory could be a weapon, that the story of a death could be more powerful than the death itself. The Great Heathen Army also changed the nature of Viking warfare. The earlier raids had been opportunistic, small-scale affairs, hit-and-run attacks that took advantage of surprise and mobility. The Great Heathen Army demonstrated that Vikings could organize on a much larger scale, could sustain campaigns that lasted for years, could take and hold territory, could defeat the armies of kings in open battle. This required a level of organization and logistics that went beyond what had been necessary for raiding. It required leaders who could coordinate the actions of multiple war bands, who could manage supplies and maintain discipline, who could negotiate with local populations and extract tribute without destroying the economic base that made tribute possible. It required a strategic vision that went beyond the next raid, that thought in terms of years and decades rather than seasons. And it required a willingness to adapt, to learn from enemies, to adopt new tactics and technologies when the old ones no longer worked. The Vikings who invaded England in 865 were different from the Vikings who had raided Lindisfarne in 793. They were more sophisticated, more organized, more dangerous. And the lessons they learned in England would be applied in other conquests, in other lands, creating a legacy of Viking expansion that would reshape the medieval world. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok and the Great Heathen Army is ultimately a story about the power of narrative, about the way that stories shape reality, that memory becomes history, that the death of one man can set in motion events that change the world. Ragnar may or may not have been a real person. The details of his life and death may be legend rather than fact. But the story of his death and the response of his sons was real in its consequences. It provided a justification for an invasion that might have happened anyway, but that gained added force and legitimacy from the narrative of vengeance. It united disparate war bands under a common cause, transforming a collection of individual warriors into an army with a shared purpose. It created a legend that would inspire future generations, that would be told and retold, that would become part of the cultural DNA of the Viking world. And it demonstrated in the most brutal and uncompromising way possible that in the world of the early medieval North, some debts could only be paid in blood, that honor and reputation were worth more than life, that the bonds of kinship and loyalty were stronger than the fear of death. The invasion that began with Ragnar's death in a pit of snakes ended with the transformation of England, the establishment of the Danelaw, the creation of a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture that would shape the island for centuries. It was not a clean or simple process. It involved decades of warfare, countless deaths, the destruction of kingdoms, and the displacement of populations. It involved suffering on a scale that is difficult for us to comprehend. Villages burned, families torn apart, lives destroyed. But it also involved adaptation and innovation, the blending of cultures, the creation of something new out of the collision of two very different worlds. The Vikings who settled in England did not remain Vikings. They became Anglo-Danes, English people with Norse names and Norse customs, Christians who remembered their pagan past, farmers who told stories of their warrior ancestors. And the Anglo-Saxons who survived the invasion did not remain unchanged. They learned from their enemies, adopted their tactics, absorbed their culture, became something different from what they had been before. Out of the violence and chaos of the Great Heathen Army came the foundations of medieval England, a unified kingdom that would eventually emerge from the wreckage of the invasion, stronger and more cohesive than the collection of rival kingdoms that had existed before. The memory of Ragnar's death and the vengeance that followed became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of actions, of the way that violence begets violence, that death demands death, that the cycle of revenge can consume generations. But it was also a story about duty and honor, about the obligations that bind families and communities, about the importance of maintaining reputation and fulfilling promises. In the harsh world of early medieval Europe, where life was short and brutal, where survival depended on the strength of one's kin and the fear of one's enemies, these were not abstract virtues. They were practical necessities, the glue that held society together, the code that governed behavior and gave meaning to existence. The sons of Ragnar understood this. They understood that their father's death demanded a response, that to fail to avenge him would be to dishonor themselves and their family, to demonstrate weakness that would invite further attacks, to break the bonds of kinship that were the foundation of their world. And so they gathered an army, and they invaded, and they destroyed kingdoms, and they changed history. They did it not because they were evil or bloodthirsty, though they were certainly capable of great violence, but because they were fulfilling an obligation, honoring a debt, maintaining the social order as they understood it. The Great Heathen Army was many things, but at its core, it was a response to a death, a demonstration that in the Viking world, memory was power, that stories mattered, that the dead could shape the actions of the living in ways that were profound and lasting and ultimately transformative.